Hey, welcome back guys, Mr. Randolph here. In this video, I want to go over some eukaryotic cell structures that provide structure and support for the cell. So we'll look at a few of those structures in this video. Down here, as with all the other cell structure videos, I define organelles for you. Those are the internal membrane-bound structures within a cell. And thinking back, remember that's only going to be in eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotes or prokaryotic cells don't have those membrane-bound structures inside them. Actually, in this video, though, the structures that we're going to talk about aren't really membrane-bound. They're different things within the cell that really provide kind of support and make the cells the shapes and have the structure that they do. So let's go ahead and dive in and see what we're going to look at here. So here's a standard kind of illustration of an animal cell. It's by no means drawn to any kind of scale, but what we can see here are all the different parts inside of the animal cell. So what we're going to look at today is going to be the cell membrane. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about cytoplasm, what it does. And we're going to talk about something that's not pictured here, the cytoskeleton. And so you'll find that within animal cells. It's just not in this picture here. Plant cell. One of the things in the plant cell or on the plant cell that's not on an animal cell that we are going to talk about today is the cell wall. So the cell wall here, plant cells also have a cell membrane. There's also cytoplasm in there, and there's also some proteins that provide a cytoskeletal structure within that plant cell. So let's talk about the boundaries, the things that form boundaries within cells. That's going to be your cell membrane. Sometimes that's called the plasma membrane, so don't get confused if you see that or read that somewhere or you hear somebody saying, oh, the plasma membrane. Yeah, it's the same thing. The cell membrane, the plasma membrane, you'll see it referred to as a fluid mosaic model because of the way that the cell membrane is put together. I have a video that goes into detail about the job of the cell membrane, and I talk a little bit more about the structures that make the cell membrane up. For this video, I just want you to know that it serves as a boundary for the cell, and then the cell wall and what its job is. And so let's look at those a little more closely here. The plasma membrane or the cell membrane you're going to see in all cells. It's the skin of the cell. It's what separates it from everything around it. In an animal cell, it's the only thing on the outside of the cell. And then in a plant cell, you'll see, or any cell that has a cell wall, the cell membrane is going to be that first layer inside, and then you'll have the cell wall on the outside. The thing about it is the cell membrane is made up of a lot of different molecules, but the biggest portion of it is made up of what are called phospholipids, these lipid molecules that have a phosphate group on the head of them. They're really kind of fluid. They move around a lot. They don't stack up on top of each other nice and neatly. They move around quite a bit, and it allows that cell membrane to be flexible. So it can kind of bend and move around and really adapt and react to the environment that's around it. And so just the structure of the cell membrane allows it to be that flexible kind of, membrane around the cell. It's like the skin. So you can squeeze and move and bend and do all of that with your skin. You can do the same thing with the cell membrane. Because it is on all cells and it's that outer layer, it really controls what goes in and out of the cell. It has specific proteins that are on the outside, the inside, and move through the membrane there. It allows certain substances in and out. It keeps substances from getting into the cell. It keeps certain things from getting out of the cell. So it serves that kind of gatekeeper role. It controls what goes in and out of the cell. By doing that, it allows the cell to keep this homeostasis, or homeo is same, stasis is state. So the cell stays in the same state. It can keep certain amounts of water or other substances inside of it so that it stays the same and can do its job very efficiently. So the cell membrane's job is to do that. The cell wall, on the other hand, is, we typically talk about it initially being in plant cells, but you're going to find cell walls in a lot of other organisms. A lot of bacteria and protists, as well as fungi, have cell walls. The cell wall is a rigid structure on the outside that protects the cell. That's really its job. The cell membrane still controls what moves in and out. The cell wall is going to have these little spots within it that things can move between the outside of the cell into where the cell membrane is, and then the cell membrane decides whether or not it can go into the cell. In plants, this cell wall is made of a molecule called cellulose. Cellulose is really made up of a lot of glucose molecules put together in a certain way. That glucose stacks up like bricks and can make a very rigid structure. And so that is really what the woody parts of plants has a lot of that cellulose in it. It's what causes twigs to snap when you bend them and things like that. Fungi, the cell wall in a fungus is made up of another molecule called chitin, which does the same kind of thing. It stacks up nice and neat and provides that rigid, almost brick-like structure that protects the cell. Animal cells don't have that. It's a good thing that we don't, because if we were made up of cells that had cell walls, we wouldn't be able to bend and move the way that we do, or would snap kind of like a twig. So that's the part of the cell wall. It's just an inflexible and not moving part of the cell that really gives plants their rigidity, where animals just have the cell membrane and are able to kind of move around. Cytoplasm. Cytoplasm really is what's going to help organize the cell. It's exactly what it sounds like. And we do this a lot in biology, and I'll do this for you in a lot of videos. Let's break the word apart. Cyto means cell. Anything that has cyto in it, whether it's the beginning, middle, or last part of the word, is referring to something that has to do with cells. And then plasm is just that plasma, cytoplasma, or cell plasma, really. And what it is a liquid that's got a lot of dissolved particles and molecules in it. It's got water, and it's pretty thick. In fact, down here we see it's thicker than toothpaste. And what it does is it holds all of these cell parts really where they're supposed to be. They can still move through there. Molecules can move through the cytoplasm. So it's not very solid. It allows things to move across the cell, which is terribly important. But it's thick enough to hold things where they need to be, so they don't just all sink to the bottom of the cell. And that's the job of the cytoplasm, and you'll see that again in all cell types. The last thing that I want to talk about here is the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton is proteins that are put together in this kind of linear, or almost like a fiber here, that acts as the skeleton of the cell. It gives it the structure. With plant cells, you don't necessarily need that because the cell wall is going to give it that rigid structure. But animal cells are going to need the cytoskeleton to really hold them in a specific shape. When you start looking at specialized cells like a muscle cell or a skin cell, they have very specific shapes based on their jobs. And the cytoskeleton actually holds the cell in that particular shape that it needs to be. You can see in this picture these microtubules or filaments that are spread throughout here. Those are those proteins that make up the cytoskeleton and hold it in a very specific shape. And so, while these things aren't really what we would call organelles, they're not surrounded by a membrane and doing certain jobs that way, they do carry out very specific functions. So I do want you to know about that. This picture here is actually showing a specific type of protein called F-actin, which is found in almost all cell types. It's a really important protein that you see in muscle cells. This one has been stained green, so you can see where all of the cytoskeleton is within this cell. So you can see that it really does hold the cell in that very specific shape. Hopefully this video helps clear up the job of the cell membrane, cell wall, cytoplasm, and cytoskeleton, and how they provide structure and support for those cells. In some other videos, I'll go into more detail about the other organelles and what their roles are.